Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. I have two cats sitting on top of me simultaneously. This is one of the advantages of winter. It's not even that cold, but the cats are now um, piling on top of me in multiples. This is Boots rarely ever shows up in videos, but there he is. Bo is almost always in videos. But anyway, so back when the number of the videos was reaching 60, I did a whole list of 10 idiosyncratic horror movies. And part of the premise of that was these were movies that never show up on anybody's top 10 list. And I just saw a top 20 list that listed a lot of movies that I kind of considered for that list. But that's the thing about horror. I mean, part of the conceit of that idiosyncratic top 10 horror list was that, horror is one of those genres that there's such a variety. It's kind of hard to say what a top 10 really even is because it's so individualized. Things show up on those top 10 lists frequently, but that also helps me. Just the concept of a top 10 list helps me really consider why we assess things certain ways. Do we assess them because they do already show up on top 10 lists? Do we assess them, especially something like horror? It involves partly admitting that something scares you, and so how does that sort of vulnerability affect your ability to effectively assess how good a particular horror movie is? So I was trying to, and this is sort of related to my last episode, where I talked about how to counteract cognitive biases. How do you counteract cognitive biases when you're doing a relative assessment of, like, a top 10, for example? How much does their pre-existence on a top 10 list really affect your present assessment of a particular text, like a movie? And so I saw a couple of ones I had considered. This was a top 20 disturbing movies that you could find on Netflix. These are all on Netflix. And I enjoyed most of the top 20, but I wrote down 8 of them arbitrarily. And they all kind of have a similar sort of plot structure, in a sense that they have a similar sort of a treatment of characters and a similar sort of plot structure, in the sense that they start off with uncertainty. Here's my rainbow circle. Let me get the rainbow circle. They start off with degree of uncertainty. There you go. And they're harder to really fit into a genre, into a subgenre. I mean, they're horror, so they fit into the genre of horror. There you go. They fit into the genre of horror. So they start off with uncertainty. There's a sense of dread, certainly. So it starts off in the middle, in the green center. The irrational, empathetic, emotional, or visceral experience, where you feel a sense of dread, vulnerability, and uncertainty. But a lot of the times in a narrative, including a horror movie, in a narrative, that uncertainty that you feel is tempered by level 3. So you go from level 1 to level 3. It's tempered by that level 3. Once you recognize what type of movie it is, once you recognize it's a horror movie, I kind of know how horror movies go. But there's so many subgenres in a horror movie that sometimes you can manipulate the schematic uncertainty to heighten fear. So one of the ones on the list, Fractured was really low on the list. It wasn't really my favorite. I mean, it was interesting. It was had some fun moments. It's that sort of horror movie, kind of like Red Eye with Jodie Foster, where you're uncertain whether or not your protagonist is hallucinating. That's kind of the idea. And so one of the patterns in a lot of these is uncertainty about the protagonist. And so it goes to some disturbing places, some really vulnerable situations. I mean, what's that? Not Red Eye. What was the one with Jodie Foster where she's on a plane? Whatever that one with Jodie Foster where she's on a plane, and her child disappears. I think Fracture kind of riffs on that same sort of gimmick, but it's an even more vulnerable place because it's this parent who's worried about his kid, and he's going through a hospital, accusing the hospital of some sort of conspiracy. And, you know, so that really heightens the sense of vulnerability in the sense that it's a kid in a hospital. It's in a place where everybody's vulnerable. You have this power structure that if they're really running some sort of conspiracy, you know, it really does heighten that sort of vulnerability. This would be a lot easier without a dog in my face. Dog in my face. Okay, sit down, baby. Just sit down. Just sit down. Just sit down. There we go. There we go. You can just sit right there. That's totally okay. Emelie. Emelie is another just an amazingly intense movie. Not necessarily a gory movie, but it sort of plays on that same kind of thing where Emelie is this babysitter. I guess I can't avoid spoilers too much, but she's this babysitter and it just slowly ramps up. And I think that's the structure. You start off in an uncertain place, and it slowly ramps up in order to heighten the tension. It just sort of ratchets that tension up and up and up. And Emelie works that way too, certainly, where you have this babysitter. She starts off a little weird, a little uncertain what she's even gonna do. Really erratic. She starts, you know, sort of pushing the boundaries of what you expect from a babysitter. It's a very vulnerable place for sure. And she starts doing crazier and crazier things. And so it's terrifying. It's terrifying without really being gory, but it's terrifying just because she has that power dynamic, sort of like in the hospital in Fracture. She has this power dynamic over these extremely vulnerable characters. And you just don't know what her motivation is, and it, you know, heightens that uncertainty. Why is she being so cruel and weird? Is she going to kill the kids? I mean, there's all kinds of heightened tension there. Tusk is I'm surprised anybody put that on the top 20 list because that's a wacky movie. But it's surprising. I mean, it shifts tones really dramatically. I mean, that's the thing about Tusk. That schematic uncertainty, it uses it in a very, very different way. Some of these movies, that schematic uncertainty heightens the tension, whereas Tusk, it really shifts what it is so radically from minute to minute. It's a body horror story. It's sort of a riff on Human Centipede, and I love the Human Centipede. I have no shame in admitting I love the Human Centipede films. It's sort of a riff on the Human Centipede, but Justin Long, you know, spoiler, I guess, but it's a wacky, wacky movie. Justin Long's being turned into a walrus. And it's like it's a ridiculous premise. It's absolutely a ridiculous premise. But a lot of it is played very seriously. So it sort of, you can very, very easily call it a really bad movie, you know, and I think most people do, because of this. But I think it's a fascinating movie to watch because of just how that radical tonal shifting constantly keeps you on edge, which is what a horror movie is supposed to do. But it keeps you on edge in a way that you just don't ever really see in a movie. Like, are they being serious? Well, they are kind of serious. Well, no, they're definitely not being serious. Wait a second, they are actually kind of serious. The wacky Johnny Depp character kind of ruins it for me personally. But if it was just Justin Long being turned into a walrus and that real tonal uncertainty about just how much of a joke it actually was. Await further instructions. There's another one. Wait Further Instructions was really fascinating. It was very, very cheap looking. And I love the really cheap effects at the end, sort of the stop motion effects at the end. But that's definitely one where it definitely heightens that schematic uncertainty where you just aren't really sure at all what kind of a movie this is. This family gets, on Christmas, gets trapped in their house, and the TV starts giving them these messages, and so they're not quite certain what this thing is going on. They get all kinds of weird messages. They speculate about what could possibly be happening, and I love the ending. It's a very cheaply made movie, but I love the ending. Spoiler, the TV wants them to worship. I mean, it's sort of a monster inside of the TV, which is always a trope that I enjoy. The TV wants them to worship it. It's these little wire creatures manipulating them to killing each other, and it wants to be worshipped. I don't know. I mean, it's a weird, fascinating movie. Oh, Christine was a movie, disturbing movies, not just horror movies. Christine is not a horror movie, but for a while I was obsessed with the story of Bud Dwyer, the guy who killed himself on live TV. And I wrote a story called The War about that. But there's a movie called Christine about a reporter who did something like that. Really fascinating case. But that one starts off sort of a similar way, where you're just not quite sure where it's going to go, because I didn't know the case, so you're not quite sure where it's going to go. You're not quite sure, the character is really off-putting. And that's sort of a pattern where, most sort of stories will try to make at least one of the characters really likable. Christine had a really complicated personality, and she was really hard to like at first. She was so intense in many ways. But it was leading to her on-air suicide. So, she's very, very complicated sort of a character. Terrifier. There's another one. Terrifier is just a totally fun movie. It's about an evil clown slaughtering people in these wacky, super fun. I mean, if you like that kind of thing, I grew up on Thrasher movies. It's really a throwback Thrasher movie. I just wanted to throw that in there because it's fun. It doesn't quite follow the same pattern as the other ones. I mean, it's schematic. I mean, that's where it doesn't really do the schematic uncertainty, the schematic shifting all that much. It's a Thrasher movie, and it makes no hesitation about the Thrasher movie. The performance by the clown character is just very unsettling in many ways. Just very enjoyably unsettling. If you want just a really scary clown, I mean, there's a lot of scary clown movies. I think this clown would be up there in terms of just unsettling clowns. But just a very, very over the top, very wacky sort of a movie. This has kind of a schematic shifting, because I think one of the questions you always have in a Thrasher movie is it a killer or is it a supernatural force? And so there is some schematic shifting there. You're not quite sure if the evil clown is a supernatural force. The Invitation. I might have mentioned The Invitation, but I love The Invitation because The Invitation, I guess classifying it as a horror movie is kind of a spoiler, because you're not even sure if it's a horror movie. You have that uncertainty up front. It's this group of friends. You think it's kind of a dramatic movie. You have this group of friends, and they sort of subtly weave in this cult. I'm not even sure what you would classify it as, but it kind of comes off like Scientology, but it turns out it's spoiler. It turns out it's a murder cult. So it really ramps up. And again, you have these sort of off-puttingly unlikable characters just throughout. You have that same sort of slow build. It's not nearly as vulnerable a context as Emelie and Fractured, but just the pacing, the very, very slow pacing up front, and then the really quick ramping up towards the end. It's just a very well-paced movie in terms of keeping the audience tied in the space of uncertainty about what the story even was for a good portion of the movie, and then it just ramps up into this crazy space. And the number one movie was Eyes of My Mother. I love Eyes of My Mother. I can't believe it. That is definitely one I would have put on the list, and I forgot. I mean, I thought about it later. It's one of those movies where I couldn't quite remember the name because it does have a similar name to a lot of other disturbing, dark, strange sort of movies. But Eyes of My Mother is great, underappreciated horror movie. And semi-spoilers, but it starts off with this vulnerable situation. I mean, it starts off what seems to be it sort of draws you into this prediction of what the story is going to be, where it's this mother and this daughter, and a man comes into the house, and it turns out he's, this evil, violent attacker. But spoiler, it turns out the daughter is crazy. The daughter is very crazy and takes so many very unexpected twists and turns where she sort of enacts the same sort of scenario on other people in these very disturbing sort of ways, but it has that same sort of The Invitation has a very steady sort of building of menace and uncertainty, then really ramps up. Whereas Eyes of My Mother, it ramps up and then twists all over the place. So you're just not ever really certain what's going to happen. But there's lots and lots of just really, really disturbing parts of that movie. But the main character, I mean, she's a character who is dark and twisted, but very vulnerable and very complicated in so many different ways that she's just a really compelling, just really, really compelling character. She's sympathetic in some ways. I mean, she's crazy. She kills lots of people. Spoiler. But she's sympathetic in so many ways because, she manages to bridge this paradox. There's paradox. There's level 2, paradox. She manages to bridge this paradox between being very, very sympathetic, but also very, very off-putting and disturbing and dark and all that sort of stuff. And just generally with horror movies, you don't have as much of a deep attachment with the characters. That's just the nature of the sort of stimulation that they're eliciting. Is that relatively low attachment to characters heightens the actual effect of the horror. Whereas in this one, you do have occasional horror movies where you do have a deeper sort of attachment, and it just creates a very different sort of effect. If you had a deeper attachment, it would no longer, arguably, for the most part, if you had a deeper attachment, it wouldn't be a horror movie, it would be more like a tragedy or an intense sort of a drama. And The Eyes of My Mother, definitely a horror movie in many ways, but the complexity of the character and the sort of attachment that you have to her and the sympathy that you have for turns it into more of a tragic, dramatic sort of a story. It's a really fascinating movie. I just wanted to add those to my list. The whole nature of my list is ones that I've never seen on a list before, and I saw this on a list. A lot of really unexpected movies that I would never expect on a list, like for anybody, ended up on this list. But also ones that aren't on the canon sort of lists that you tend to see. And ones that I wouldn't pick just to be cool. Like Under the Skin was on that list. It's a great movie. It's a beautiful movie. But if I picked Under the Skin, would I be picking that just so to sound fancy and cool and what have you? Whereas Tusk, who's going to choose Tusk? Nobody's ever going to choose Tusk in order to sound cool. But it is a fascinating movie. It's worth watching. I wouldn't necessarily call it a masterpiece. But it is an utterly fascinating movie. If you're a fan of horror movies, watch it just for the twists and turns and the expectations. Whereas The Eyes of My Mother might be one where I would sort of drop that name and say, here's a cool, obscure, very complicated horror movie that you might not have seen before. That sort of thing. But anyway, that's it. I might come back to, just other horror movies that I forgot that to add to that same list. It might grow to be an infinite list one of these days. We'll see. But have a good night. See you in the next episode.